Well, hello and welcome to this week's A Photographic Life, which is going to begin with some words of wisdom from an unexpected source. You need hands to hold someone you care for. You need hands to show that you're sincere. When you feel nobody wants to know you, you need hands to brush away the tears. You need hands to show the world you're happy, and you need hands when you have to stop the bus. But the hands we love so dear are the hands we love to hear, are the hands that you give to us. It's Max Bygraves there from 1958. Do you remember? I want to tell you a story. Well, that's about as good an impression as I'm going to give. But anyway, for those of you around the world who aren't aware of Max Bygraves, by all means, Google him. Just a kind of a singer, kind of entertainer guy. But I think we need hands in photography also. Now, I know what you're going to say. Of course you do, Grant. We need hands to hold the camera and everything else. Well, what I'm talking about here are hands in photographs, using the hands, particularly in portrait photography, to, I suppose in a sense, frame the sitter, but also give us powerful compositions. Penn, Irving Penn, was the master of using hands. Karsh was very good, as was Arnold Newman. The photographer Cecil Beaton said that it was important to keep hands soft. I often follow that dictate myself when I'm working and making portrait images. I recently saw a series of portraits, really powerful, strong portraits, which I felt were very much in the style, I suppose, genre of Irving Penn. They were by Chris Floyd, a friend to the podcast, and they are of the actor Rupert, what's his name now? Can't remember his name. Oh my gosh. Rupert Everett. There you go. I should have remembered that. But anyway, there you go. So look out for Chris Floyd's pictures of Rupert Everett, the actor. So the use of hands. I think this is probably going to be the first time in all of the episodes that we've recorded that I'm going to give, I suppose, a little bit of advice that might help you out directly with your photography. So often I hear people being photographed and saying that they feel uncomfortable and they don't know what to do with their hands. And I hear photographers saying in return, well, don't worry about it, just let them hang down or let them drop. But I think this is a wasted opportunity. I really think that the use of the hands can raise the level of that image. It doesn't mean to say it's going to work, but it certainly means it's worth trying. But I don't see a lot of photographers doing this, and I think that's a great shame. So what we're really doing here is using the hands to frame the photograph, perhaps to create angles within the composition, to lead the viewer into an image. There are so many ways in which we can use hands. So this week's tip is get the hands into your photograph. And of course, check out Max Bygraves. I don't know why, because nothing on this podcast is really planned, but for some reason the photographer Bruce Gilden has been mentioned a few times recently here. And I saw a film the other day which he'd made for Wex Photographic, straightforward kind of little short film that appears on YouTube of so many photographers nowadays, particularly created by brands, which I have to say I think they're kind of a bit lazy in their format and their approach, but, perfectly okay. Anyway, on this, Gilden was talking about his work as usual, the first camera he ever owned and all of that kind of stuff. But he also said something that I thought was, two things actually, which were really important. One of them directly ties in with Bill and I's conversation last week concerning street photography, because Gilden says in the film that everyone today thinks they are a street photographer, but he has some news for them, which is that they're not. And that was kind of interesting, bearing in mind just how much feedback we've had from you about last week's episode. It really does seem to be the case that street photography really does kind of rile people up. There seems to be a lot of sensitivity there. But anyway, I have to say, most of the feedback we've received has been incredibly positive. which is always nice. But anyway, so he spoke about that. But then the other thing that really, I think it's got picked up upon by a few people online and a few people who write articles based on kind of very little really, because I looked through the film looking for a great revelation and I didn't find the one that was being promoted. But anyway, what he did say was that he funds everything he does and he has done over the last 5 years. And on that kind of trajectory, he'll be broke in a year. Now, why I thought that was interesting, I mean, the people I'm saying who picked up on it were saying, oh, Bruce Gilden's running out of money, there's no money in professional photography and so forth and so on and so forth. Well, of course, if Gilden sells prints, which is primarily where the money is for that kind of work, I don't ever think that you're going to make a lot of money out of books, because let me tell you now, you will not. If you cover your costs, you're doing well. If you have an exhibition and you manage to get some kind of merch deal, just like with bands on tour, you might make some money out of the merch. Maybe Bruce Gilden baseball caps are the next thing we should be seeing. But primarily, it's going to be through print sales. And for him, I would have thought the majority of those print sales come from the classic images that he's created over his career. And as I've spoken about before, I mean, there's some great work there, particularly for me from the Coney Island work. But anyway, so I think what's interesting about this is that so often I think it's very easy to get kind of pulled into the belief or kind of seduced by the idea that people like Gilden are making a huge amount of money out of this street photography, and therefore that's the way to make a living. Quite often I'll make a comment in response to a kind of a naive comment on threads in particular at the moment, where I'll kind of point out the realities of working as a photographer and earning a living, which I do know about. I mean, I've been involved in it for 42 years and I'm still a working photographer. So, you know, it is my bread and butter as well as the other things I do. But, you know, what Gilden was saying there was, you know, I'm paying for this. And I don't think a lot of street photographers really understand the business side of it. They will talk about creating art and people are going to buy into their art and so on and so forth. But I can tell you that that doesn't happen very often. And as we all know, Instagram likes are not Instagram payments necessarily. We can go into all of that world. But anyway, I thought it was kind of an interesting thing. There's always a lot of conversation around professional photography and what does it mean. And invariably, I find that the people who are telling me what it means are the people who've never done it. But maybe I'm wrong. Who knows? Maybe it has all changed, as I'm constantly being told. However, the people I know who are working tell me it hasn't. So I think I'm going to stick with that. I've spoken before, earlier this year, about the book that I had come out, Inside Vogue House, all about the history of the magazines that came out of Vogue House in London. That book came out late spring this year. Well, I recently had a conversation with Neil James, who runs the Photo Walk podcast, which I think is a really nice kind of warm community feeling podcast, very English in its kind of way. But I think he's probably got a good international following also. So I recently had a conversation with him about that book, which is available now on his podcast. So if you'd like to hear somebody interviewing me for a change, why not check out the Photo Walk podcast? I think online it's Photo Walk show. But you can just put in Photo Walk podcast into Spotify or any other platform, and I'm sure you'll find it. If you do, I hope you enjoy it. On a recent episode of Seesaw with Fiona Hayes, you may remember that we discussed the Fragile Beauty photographic show, which is currently running at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, but available also in a very nicely produced book. So if you're unable to make the show, why not have a look at the book? And it's the collection of work of Elton John and David Furnish. Well, I'm recording this shortly before I'm due to go to a talk being given as part of the Cheltenham Literature Festival by the curators of that very photographic show. Now, I don't need to fill you in on everything I'm doing, but I will definitely give you some feedback as to how that goes, because what did come out of the conversation, I feel, that Fiona and I had, was that we were interested in how it was actually curated. So I'm hoping to ask the curators exactly how that happened. And if I get some information that is enlightening, I'll definitely bring it to you on a episode in the future. But I thought what was interesting was I went to get tickets, and bear in mind this isn't Elton John or David Furnish, but the tickets are £16 to hear these two curators speak about it. It's in a kind of temporary theatre space as part of the festival, but it's sold out. And it's quite a big space. This isn't a small room of people just talking about photography. Now, I find this very interesting, that photography can have that level of interest. Okay, maybe it's because it's Elton John, maybe it's because it's David Furnish, I don't know. But you've got to be pretty interested in photography to hear and pay £16 to hear two curators talking about something that you may not have seen. And I presume they're going to put some slides up. So what it made me think was that there seems to be a dropout now of photo festivals. There was a time when there were so many going on each year, in the UK in particular, and now there are hardly any. There are a number that have seemed to have grown up around the photo book. Bob Books on Photography in Bristol, I think, is a great success, a 2-day event which takes place, I think it's in October. But anyway, it's well worth looking out for that. And every time I do go, I'm certainly going off a bit of a tangent here, but every time I do go, somebody seems to hear me talking and come up and say, "Are you Grant Scott from the podcast?" And of course I always say yes and have a lovely chat. So if you do hear me out and about and you don't recognise me because you won't know what I look like, but if you do hear me, do come over and say hello. It'd be lovely to meet you. Anyway, what it made me think was more photography within these traditional events allows us to expand that audience so that we're not always talking to the same people who know the same things in the same way. If you have that kind of very narrow focused community, everything gets very small and then eventually dies. So I'll bring you news from the Cheltenham Literature Festival in a couple of weeks' time. I forgot to mention earlier when I was talking about hand, something else I wanted to talk about, which has died out in photography, but was once such a useful prop and such an essential prop, actually, which was cigarettes. Cigarettes used to appear in all photographs, and I suppose, well, all photographs, a lot of photographs, but, you know, there wasn't that stigma attached to smoking at the time. And of course, it could be visually interesting with the smoke coming off and all of that kind of stuff. You know what I'm talking about. Go back to the work of Georges Hurel, or again, Penn, or so forth, or Karsh. But also, of course, the cigarette being brought to the mouth or being held also introduced the hand into the photograph. So that was kind of interesting. Reminds me of a photo shoot I did a good few years ago now with the musician Finlay Quay, who had a moment in the pop sunshine with a big hit album and single. And there's no doubt that Finlay liked to smoke what was once referred to as a jazz cigarette, and I'll leave it at that for your own interpretation as to what that may have been. But it was certainly a pungent odour, and it was a particularly large jazz cigarette that he was smoking when I photographed him. The air was itself quite pungent, and I will have to say, as a non-smoker and a non-indulger in any form of drugs, it certainly made me quite hungry for a few snacks. Anyway, so I continued making the photographs and allowed him to continue smoking throughout them. He was sitting on a chair in a white room, and he had this big joint. And I really liked the picture, actually, I have to say. I thought it just worked really well. It was really, really him. He was particularly chilled, and the photo shoot was great fun. I actually had a CD that I put on, which I wanted to introduce him to. And I think it's about 78 versions or something of Louie Louie, the great song. And So pungent was the air that both Finley and I decided to have a little dance whilst we were also making the pictures. So, fun can be had. I should say also this was commissioned photography for a magazine. So there you go, part of the business. But anyway, I handed in the pictures, and of course they asked for the large cigarette to be removed before it could be published, and it ended up with him with his hand in the air making a gesture. And no spliff, joint, jazz cigarette, whatever you want to call it, in his hand. So there you go. Something else I forgot that I wanted to mention. I don't see a lot of hands in photographs. And of course, I don't see a lot of cigarettes anymore. A listener contacted me recently via Instagram with a direct message, alerting me to a conversation that was happening due to the writer on photography and photographer David Campney, who had posted on Instagram about an experience he had with a podcast recording all around the idea of how photographers should present themselves. He found himself on a panel, briefly tell you this, he found himself on a panel with a couple of other people, a publisher, a curator, and somebody else, I'm not sure who the other person was. And the other people were being, in his mind, very dogmatic about the idea of how photographers should present themselves, saying that they were busy people and therefore there were rules, and they expected the photographers to follow the rules. And David really kind of responded to this strongly, evidently, and it got quite heated to the extent that the podcast, I suppose, what would you call it, recorder, person responsible for it, whoever it was, maybe presenter, decided that the podcast can't go out and it shouldn't be heard. There was an uproar around this in the comments to the Instagram post of people saying that David was right, and therefore they wanted to hear this conversation so that they could make their mind up for themselves. Well, I posted on that and I said to David, well, look, come on here and we'll have a conversation, because I think it'll be quite a rigorous discussion, because from my perspective, how you present yourself is all about context and appropriateness of that context. So I think that could be very interesting. Well, David's got back to me, and I think we're going to do it. So hopefully we will, and look out for that one over the coming weeks. As you can probably tell, podcast is really taking off. Lots of people contacting me saying they want to be on here. Most of them not appropriate, I have to say, but also some very interesting potential conversations coming up over the coming months. So do stay tuned. Do please like, rate, and share this podcast. If each one of you that listens just shared it through the sharing symbol wherever you're listening to it, that would really help us grow the podcast. I'm deliberately keeping it not having any advertising, despite, again, being bombarded with people who want to sponsor and put adverts on here. I'm not going to do that, but it would really help me grow the audience if you could just do that on my behalf. I'm just a one-man band. As Leo Sayer said, nobody knows or understands. Anyway, that's enough of the terrible references to songs probably before your time. Just leaves me to say, of course, as the fall, as the autumn is rich with golden colour, just as Keats described it. Oh, and also I should just say, for the person who described the podcast as academic, I really hope we've brought it down from that lofty peak, because I never want it to be that this week. Anyway, that's about all for this week. Take care.